It's October 1929. The New York Stock Exchange is in free fall. In 1 week, investors lose $30 billion. That's $500 billion in today's money. Grown men are weeping on the floor of Wall Street. Banks are failing across the country. But here's what your history teacher got wrong. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression. What turned a bad recession into a decade-long catastrophe was one decision, made by one man, in one room. On June 17, 1930, President Herbert Hoover picked up a pen. 122 of America's top economists had signed a letter begging him to stop. He signed it anyway. Within 3 years, global trade collapsed by 66%. Unemployment hit 25%. And the economic chaos helped bring Adolf Hitler to power. All because of a tariff bill almost nobody remembers today. This is the story of the Smoot-Hawley Act and how the road to the Great Depression was paved with good intentions. But it didn't start in 1930. It started in the farmlands of America, where a senator was about to make the worst deal in economic history. To understand how this happened, you need to understand one thing. A tariff is just a tax on foreign goods. When an American company imports steel from Germany, the government charges a fee. That fee makes the foreign product more expensive, which makes the American product look cheaper by comparison. On paper, it sounds like protecting American workers. In practice, it's economic gasoline near an open flame. Now rewind to 1928. America is riding one of the greatest economic booms in history. The Roaring '20s are in full swing. Stock prices are soaring. New cars, radios, and refrigerators are flying off shelves. But underneath the glitter, American farmers are struggling. After World War I, Europe rebuilt its own farms. Suddenly, American wheat and corn had too much competition. Farm prices crashed through the floor. Rural America was already in a depression before Wall Street noticed. Enter Senator Reed Smoot of Utah. Smoot was a powerful, deeply religious Republican senator. He'd been in office since 1903. He knew his voters were farmers, and his farmers were furious. His solution was simple and completely wrong. Raise tariffs on imported agricultural goods. Make foreign food more expensive so American farmers could compete. His partner in this plan was Congressman Willis Hawley of Oregon. Together, they drafted what would become the most destructive trade bill in American history. Now here's where it gets complicated and dangerous. When Congress starts writing a tariff bill, every industry shows up with lobbyists. The farmers wanted protection for wheat. The steel industry wanted protection for steel. The textile manufacturers wanted protection for fabric. The shoe industry wanted protection for leather. One by one, exceptions became additions. Additions became expansions. What started as a targeted farm relief bill ballooned into something monstrous. By the time it passed the Senate, the bill covered over 20,000 imported goods. It raised tariffs to an average of 45%. On some goods, the rate hit 60%. This was the highest tariff wall America had ever built, and the timing could not have been worse. Here's what Smoot and Hawley didn't understand. The world economy in 1930 was not the world economy of 1890. After World War I, the global financial system was deeply interconnected. European nations owed war debts to America. They could only pay those debts by selling goods to America. If America stopped buying their goods, they couldn't pay their debts. If they couldn't pay their debts, their economies would spiral. Economists understood this chain reaction perfectly. In May 1930, over 1,000 economists signed a public petition. They sent it directly to President Hoover. The signatories included some of the most respected names in the field. Their message was blunt: do not sign this bill. It will provoke retaliation. It will destroy American exports. It will deepen the recession. Major American businesses, including Ford Motor Company, publicly opposed it. Thomas Lamont, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, called it almost gibbering. Wall Street was begging Washington to stop. The warnings were loud, credible, and completely specific. And they were ignored. Why? Because the farm lobby was louder. And because Hoover believed, against all evidence, that he could negotiate the tariffs down after signing. He was wrong. But there's something even stranger about this story. The stock market crash had already happened 7 months earlier. The recession was already underway. This bill didn't have to pass. Every signal said stop. Every expert said stop. And yet Congress voted yes. The Senate passed it 44 to 42, the narrowest possible margin. 2 votes. 2 senators switching their votes would have changed the course of history, but they didn't switch. And on June 17, 1930, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law. The moment the news broke, stock markets dropped again. Investors knew what was coming. The rest of the world was already drafting its response. And somewhere in Ottawa, London, Paris, and Berlin, trade ministers were picking up their phones. For a brief moment, Smoot and Hawley were heroes. Republican newspapers celebrated the signing. American manufacturers sent congratulatory telegrams to the White House. The farm lobby declared victory. Finally, someone was standing up for American workers. Finally, Washington was putting America first. Reed Smoot gave interviews radiating confidence. He genuinely believed he had saved American agriculture. He believed the bill would stabilize prices and protect jobs. He believed the economists were elitists who didn't understand real America. And for about 30 days, nothing catastrophic happened, which made it worse, because the retaliation, when it came, was coordinated and merciless. Canada moved first. Canada was America's largest trading partner. Within weeks, Ottawa imposed retaliatory tariffs on 16 American goods. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were surgical strikes on American export industries. American apples, cars, and machinery suddenly became uncompetitive in Canadian markets overnight. Then Britain responded. Britain abandoned its century-old policy of free trade. For the first time since 1846, Britain raised import barriers. The empire followed. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, all raising walls against American goods. Then France, then Germany, then Italy, then Spain. Country after country raised tariffs specifically targeting American exports. Within 18 months, 25 countries had formally retaliated against Smoot-Hawley. Now picture this. America had been the engine of global trade in the 1920s. American factories were producing cars, steel, chemicals, and machinery for the entire world. Those exports supported millions of American jobs, not farmer jobs, factory jobs, city jobs, the very jobs the tariff was never designed to protect. And now those markets were slamming shut. General Motors watched European sales collapse. American wheat rotted in silos because foreign buyers found new suppliers. Cotton exporters in the South lost their British buyers overnight. The cruel irony was devastating. The tariff was supposed to save American farmers. Instead, it destroyed the foreign markets those same farmers depended on. American agricultural exports dropped by 66% in 3 years. The farmers Smoot promised to protect were now worse off than before. But Smoot and Hawley weren't watching the export charts. They were watching the domestic production numbers. And in the very short term, some domestic industries did see a bump. This created a dangerous illusion. The policy looked like it was working. While the damage was building silently in trade ledgers and shipping records, Washington saw only the surface. Hoover was telling reporters the economy would recover by autumn. Business leaders who had opposed the bill publicly were now quietly hoping he was right. The stock market, having crashed in October 1929, was attempting a fragile recovery. In early 1930, markets actually bounced back somewhat. Optimism was returning. Magazine covers showed charts pointing upward. But in the banks, something else was happening. American banks had lent heavily to European businesses and governments throughout the 1920s. Those loans assumed a stable trading relationship between continents. Now that trade relationship was fracturing. European businesses were losing American customers. Their revenues were falling. Their ability to repay American loans was deteriorating. The loans on American bank balance sheets were quietly turning toxic. but nobody was talking about that yet. In Washington, the conversation had moved on. In Utah, Reed Smoot was preparing for his re-election campaign. He had no idea his signature had already set a chain reaction in motion. A chain reaction that no government on earth had the tools to stop. And 3,000 miles away, in a struggling city called Vienna, a failed painter turned political agitator was watching the economic chaos with great interest. His name was Adolf Hitler, and economic desperation was exactly the fuel his movement needed. But before we get there, we need to follow the money. Because when global trade dies, something else dies with it. And what died next would take 15 million Americans down with it. By late 1930, the illusion was cracking. American exports had fallen off a cliff. Factory orders were drying up across the Midwest. The fragile stock market recovery stalled, then reversed, then collapsed again. But the real killer wasn't the stock market. It was the banks. Here's the mechanism that turned a recession into a catastrophe. American banks in the 1920s had done something that seemed smart at the time. They lent billions of dollars to European businesses and governments. Germany alone owed American banks over $1 billion. That money was supposed to flow back as European companies earned dollars selling goods to American consumers. Smoot-Hawley slammed that door shut. European companies lost their American customers. Their revenues dropped. Their loan payments stopped. American banks started receiving default notices. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. A single bank failure in Vienna in May 1931 triggered a cascade. The Creditanstalt Bank collapsed. It was Austria's largest financial institution. Its failure sent shockwaves through every connected European bank. German banks froze. British banks wobbled. The crisis that had started on an American farm belt had now engulfed an entire continent, and it was accelerating back toward America. Panicking European investors started pulling their money out of American banks. American depositors, seeing the headlines, started doing the same. Bank runs erupted across the country. In 1930 alone, 1,350 American banks failed. In 1931, another 2,293 banks collapsed. Let that number sink in. Over 3,600 banks gone in 2 years. Every failed bank wiped out the savings of ordinary families. Farmers lost their operating loans. Small businesses lost their credit lines. Workers lost their wages. The unemployment rate, which had been 3% in 1929, crossed 10% by 1930. It crossed 15% by 1931. By 1933, it hit 24.9%. 1 in 4 American workers had no job, no income, no safety net. Social Security didn't exist yet. Unemployment insurance didn't exist yet. There was no federal deposit insurance protecting bank accounts. When your bank failed, your money was simply gone. Families who had saved for decades lost everything overnight. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Shantytowns called Hoovervilles appeared in public parks. Children went to school hungry. Farmers who couldn't make loan payments lost their land. The Dust Bowl compounded the agricultural crisis across the Great Plains. And through all of this, global trade continued its free fall. By 1932, world trade had collapsed to 1/3 of its 1929 level. Economists would later calculate that Smoot-Hawley didn't cause all of this alone. The stock market crash, reckless bank lending, and the Federal Reserve's catastrophic monetary policy all played roles. But here is the consensus that emerged over the following decades. Smoot-Hawley took a severe recession and made recovery structurally impossible. It destroyed the trade relationships that could have cushioned the blow. It triggered the bank failures that wiped out American savings. It prolonged the Depression by at least 2 to 3 years. And its effects weren't contained to America. In Germany, the economic collapse was even more savage. Germany had lost World War I. It owed war reparations it could barely afford. Its economy had been rebuilt on American loans throughout the 1920s. When those loans dried up and trade collapsed, Germany's unemployment hit 30%. 30%. An entire generation of Germans had no work, no money, and no hope. Into that vacuum stepped Adolf Hitler. His Nazi Party had been a fringe movement through the relative prosperity of the late 1920s. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis won just 2.6% of the vote. By 1932, at the peak of economic desperation, they won 37%. Historians debate the exact weight of economic factors in Hitler's rise. But there is no serious debate about this. The economic catastrophe created conditions that made his rise possible. Stable, prosperous democracies don't elect fascists. Desperate, humiliated ones sometimes do. Back in Washington, the political reckoning was arriving. In November 1932, Herbert Hoover faced the voters. He lost in a landslide to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt carried 42 of 48 states. It was one of the most devastating electoral defeats in American history. Reed Smoot lost his Senate seat in the same election. The man who had championed the tariff as farmers' salvation was voted out by farmers. His bill had destroyed the very people he claimed to protect. The damage was done. The Depression would grind on for another decade. It would take World War II to finally end it. But the reckoning, when it came, would change America permanently. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the damage was almost incomprehensible. 15 million Americans were unemployed. Nearly half of all American banks had failed. Global trade had collapsed to levels not seen since the 1800s. Roosevelt moved immediately. Within his first 100 days, he began dismantling the architecture of the Depression. But one of his most consequential moves was quieter than the others. In 1934, Roosevelt signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. It gave the president authority to negotiate tariff reductions directly with foreign countries. It was a direct repudiation of Smoot-Hawley. Washington had looked at the wreckage and made a decision. Never again would a lobby-driven Congress be allowed to build a tariff wall in secret. Trade policy would be strategic, not transactional. Over the following decades, America became the architect of a new global trading system. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, signed in 1947, was its foundation. The World Trade Organization eventually grew from that same principle. The core lesson: interconnected economies don't just trade goods. They trade stability. When you tax your neighbor's products, your neighbor taxes yours back. And the people who pay are never the politicians. They're the factory workers, the farmers, and the families. Now consider the human cost one more time. Not as a statistic, as a life. Imagine saving for 20 years, building a small farm in Kansas, watching your bank close on a Tuesday morning, walking to the window and being told your savings no longer exist. That happened to millions of real people. People who had done everything right. People who had nothing to do with tariff policy or Senate votes. They lost everything because two men in Washington thought they knew better than 128 economists. Reed Smoot died in 1941. He never publicly admitted his bill had been a catastrophic mistake. Willis Hawley lost his congressional seat in 1932 and faded into obscurity. Herbert Hoover lived until 1964. He spent decades arguing his administration had done everything possible. History disagreed. The Smoot-Hawley tariff remains one of the most studied policy failures in human history. It is taught in every serious economics program on Earth, not as a cautionary tale about tariffs specifically, but as a cautionary tale about certainty, about what happens when political pressure overrides expert consensus, about what happens when short-term domestic popularity drives long-term global decisions, about what happens when leaders confuse protecting people with isolating them. The echoes don't stay in the past. Every decade since 1930 has produced its own version of this story. Leaders promising protection, economists warning of consequences, lobbyists drowning out the warnings, and ordinary people paying the price. In 2018, a new round of American tariffs triggered a new round of global retaliation. Economists cited Smoot-Hawley within hours. The pattern is not hidden. It is not obscure. It is written in the unemployment records of the 1930s, in the breadline photographs, in the Hoovervilles, in the rise of extremism across a desperate continent. One signature, on one bill that 120 people begged one president not to sign. That is how a recession became the Great Depression. And that's how two senators and one president changed the entire world forever.